Yeah, everyone's here. I know all of you are all old faces. Good to see everyone this evening. Yeah, and good to be back. I've been missing in action for the past month and so. So good to see everyone. So again today, we're very happy to have Bhante Pandit back again to give us very interesting talk. I'm really looking forward to that. So just in case if anyone, don't know Bhante yet, so just a brief introduction of Bhante. Bhante Pandit is a British Buddhist monk and who has been ordained in Theravadian tradition for the past 25 years or more than 25 years. So his place of ordinations in 1996 is in Thailand. So he chose Thailand to be his place of ordinations, and after studying Buddhism and non-dual spirituality in various parts of the world for a number of years. And he's also the founder and principal teacher of the Little Bangkok Sangha, which for a long time has been the only Sangha offering Dharma in English in Bangkok. So Bhante has a degree in psychology and a master in Buddhist study. Various media have of his talk are available online. He's also a psychologist and university lecturer. So Bhante Pandit has a reputation for being a very engaging speaker who effortlessly makes links between the Buddha's wisdom, teaching, and contemporary understanding of consciousness. So Bhante also has specific interest in psychology and often incorporates fairy tale in his Dharma talk. So today, specifically, we have this talk about Snow White. I think I first heard Bhante's fairy tale story in the retreat at Vejasala. But Snow White is the first time that I've heard Bhante talk about Snow White. He talked about what they call Alice in Wonderland before. He talked about Monkey King. So we can't wait to hear Snow White's story today. Over to you, Bhante. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. Even it's somewhat out of date these days. But that's because I haven't done anything for several years. So, yeah. So this topic of Snow White, the Dharma of Snow White, is a current issue because Disney is under fire right now for wokeifying its movies or being accused of go woke, grow broke. And by introducing woke themes into their movies and losing lots of money. I did see a pretty good analysis of this by a young educational news channel called TLDR, if anybody has seen that, a bunch of kids fresh out of university, but they do some really good information. And they actually analyzed what woke ideology is, what are the main themes of it, and then listed a whole bunch of movies in terms of how woke were they, the woke themes were in there. You know what I mean by woke, I hope. It's a common word these days. Not really. So woke means themes of, you want to put all your main characters have to be transgender or gay or lesbian. The male characters have to be switched to female characters. You have to have interracial characters, and you're switching. For example, the Little Mermaid, which used to be a white character and has recently Disney switched to be black. And all for no other reason than they want to prove how they are inclusive organization. However, this analysis by TLDR suggested that in actual fact, most of Disney's problems with not being able to sell their movies and making a loss on the movies had more to do with poor storytelling or recycling old stories, rebooting old stories, than it did with actual themes that they're accused of, these so-called woke themes. Now, with Snow White, in the old Disney version, this was the first full-length animation that Disney ever did, and it was an incredible, massive box office success. It was cutting-edge technology. I think it was about 1936, and they were doing it in color. Previously, cartoons had always had like cartoon characters. This had a human character that looked like a human. So it was quite innovative in its time. But the modern day culture warriors have got hold of it and said, no, 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 this is no good. Why is it Snow White? Why can't it be somebody who's black or some other ethnic minority? So the new version, they've actually cast Snow White as a Hispanic, not as a white person, where the whole point of the story was that she had skin as white as snow. That was the motif that was used. They also didn't like the fact that she was, in their story, she was poisoned and fell asleep. And then she was awoken by the kiss of a prince. But the modern day culture warriors have got hold of this. So it's not acceptable that a man goes and kisses a woman while she's asleep and she hasn't given her consent. So they say this is a dreadful, dreadful thing, that the prince is an evil, it's a sex attack. This is a sexual molestation of the princess. They also didn't like that in the story, Snow White looks after the house. They say, no, 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 women can't possibly look after the house, despite the fact that the people whose house it is, who keep the house in good order, are actually 7 dwarves. Another thing the modern culture warriors have said was it's not right that there should be 7 dwarves in the movie, because that's making fun of dwarves. So in the movie, they've changed it to 7 bizarre characters, and they're no longer dwarves. But as I'll explain, there is a specific meaning behind each of these story motifs. The main arc of Snow White and similar stories is this: that while you are trying to attain to great things, you are likely to fail. But your job is to take care of the mundane things. If you take care of the mundane things in the right way, in due time, the great things will come. It's the people who are trying to push or use magic or mischief or force to get what they want in fairy tales, they're going to fail. And it's the ones who patiently do their business and do their job who in the end will succeed. And this is the lesson, the Dharma lesson too, and a life lesson that is being portrayed. So I had an example, but I can't use the internet on 2 machines at once, but there's an episode of the Brady Bunch. You all know the Brady Bunch, right? From the 1970s. So in this story, the younger girl sees the older daughter, and the older daughter says, oh, no, no, you can't put your hair up like this. You're too small. And then she goes and sees the oldest daughter, and the oldest daughter is just arranging to have a date with a boy on the phone. And she says, well, I want to have a date with a boy. And the oldest daughter says, no, 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 you can't do that. You're too young. And she says, that's the problem with my life. I was born too young. So the whole episode of the story is around this youngest daughter wanting to emulate the older daughters. And the parents are saying, you need to bide your time. You're not old enough for kind of fancy clothes and high heels and makeup and boyfriends and going out to the cinema. And so that's the theme of the episode. Now, it does show that this is a common theme for people growing up. It's not about girls, it's about children, and children wanting to grow up too fast or wanting to get the things without putting in the work. Even for adults, we can want to open up a business and be hugely successful without putting in the work. I don't know if you are a fan of Shark Tank, but I'm an avid watcher of Shark Tank. And Shark Tank Australia has just been rebooted after 5 years. And so yesterday there was a episode with a man came along with his Thai, Australian man with his Thai wife, and they've been making Thai meals and doing quite well, selling them. It's called Pum's Kitchen. And so they came onto the Shark Tank and they said, yes, we've taken $270,000 selling the meals. And the sharks were like, hey, that's pretty good. You're doing all right. And they said, yes, now we are asking you for $200,000, but we need to raise $1.8 million so that we can start producing Thai sauces. And the sharks are say to them, look, you're pitching here as a successful business selling meals. You haven't sold sauces before. You don't have any track record, and you're asking for a lot of money to go and do it. So the couple, they didn't get a deal in the Shark Tank. They were told to go back and just work step by step by step and consolidate what they are doing first. So this theme of overreach or over ambition and not biding your time or not putting in the work is a very human thing when it comes to running a business or raising children or children wanting to get older. So much of the time we are trying to jump forward to the end of the path without putting in the step-by-step work. So this is true also of meditation. And if you've followed me at all, you'll know that in recent times I've been really pushing this idea of what are the meditation attainments when one starts to really attain to the high states or the mystic states that lie beyond the ordinary mind. However, for most of us, including myself, a big part of our practice is simply dealing with the mundane mind. Most of the time, the mind just sits there thinking or wandering around or refusing to come together or not being concentrated. And our practice then is one of mindfulness of step by step by step. We can't solve all these problems. We can't get enlightened. We can't know what the mind state is when the heart is free from desire, when you have desires there. So our practice is one of step by step, thing by thing, item by item, desire by desire, watching it, learning from it, letting it go, seeing what it's like when things arise, seeing what it's like when they're there and our attachment, seeing what it's like when something disappears and ceases. And this practice of then mindfulness, of being aware just day by day, this is doing our housework. It doesn't always feel like you're attaining to the great states or really progressing very far in dharma. Certainly for myself, I can be sat here 10 years as a monk, 20 years as a monk, and sometimes I sit here and my mind's just scattered and can't come together and is dry, like the inspiration dries up, and I'm really just hammering out, trying to try and watch another boring in breath, and there's another out breath, and there's another thought. And this, I think we have to acknowledge, is our experience for most people. It gets especially frustrating if you have seen those mind states that are free from that, when the mind has stopped still and has become pristine. So you know it and you remember it. And then you're excited the next day, you come back, okay, now I get back to my meditation. And you just get dross coming up in the mind, and you're back to square one again. Or as Shunryu Suzuki used to put it, the beginner's mind, always coming back to begin again, begin again, begin again. And this, for most of us, is our reality. We can observe this thought arising. We can observe this mind state arising. We can do our best to disentangle from that thought and that mind state. We can do our best to reset and come back to the breath. Some days it's going to work beautifully. Some days it's just not going to work. So many times I sit here throughout my career as a monk, and even sometimes now, and I sit down, and then I swear when I start, I am intending to be in charge. I'm intending to meditate. I have an idea what I want to do. I think that I'm steering the ship. But what's actually happening? I'm falling asleep. This is what's happening with Joe Biden at the moment. Have you found that situation yourself when you sat down to meditate, and then you suddenly realize you've been there for 15, 20 minutes and you're just thinking about something stupid, or like, that wasn't what I intended to do. I wanted to sit and be aware. A lot of the time when the mind goes like this, you lose enthusiasm. And without enthusiasm, it's going to be very hard to catch the mind, very difficult to arouse mindfulness and awareness. And enthusiasm comes when you start to attain to these pristine mind states. When the mind is dull and scattered, then your enthusiasm is going to be very low. So at these times, it is our job to just keep grinding away. We have to keep on with the practice and have faith. It's not often talked about in faith. We talk about insight. We talk about wisdom. In Buddhism, we don't often talk about faith, but faith plays a huge part. We have to have faith that this day by day, moment by moment, mindfulness practice, observing, even if it seems like we're going backwards, we have to have that faith that in due course, in time, then the I don't say rewards, but the higher or clearer or brighter states of mind with deeper insight will occur down the line. Now, I'm sure all of you have had that in your time. You've experienced times when your meditation won't work. You've experienced times when suddenly your mind comes together and is very sharp and crystal clear and bright and still. So this theme of doing the work, doing the step by step, and biding your time and waiting for the karma to come to fruition, for destiny to become aligned, is a big part of any spiritual practice. In the Christian mystic tradition, Saint Teresa of Avila, they call it trials. So you're sitting there trying to attain to union with God, and you go through trials. That is, they say, God makes it difficult for you. But if you endure, then you get the rewards. I forget the word that they use, but it means rewards, that every so often in the Christian tradition, God gives you like a taster of what's to come, to give you some enthusiasm to carry on. But they are very clear that your job is to go through the trials. It's God's decision whether you get the rewards or the bright states of mind. So in all mystic traditions, and we have this idea, your job is to do the work and wait for the right time to come. So fairy tales, many fairy tales are doing this exact same thing. There's a very old fairy tale called the Golden Ass or the Golden Donkey. And in it, the heroine in the story is left alone in the house. And the stepmother has mixed together 5 different kinds of beans and has thrown them all across the floor. And her job is to sort through the beans, to sort them into 5 piles. You may note this is similar to the story of Cinderella, but she has 2 kinds of peas. Well, 5 kinds of beans means your 5 senses. And sorting through the 5 senses means you just note, this is seeing, this is hearing, this is smelling, this is tasting, this is feeling. And that's what she's doing in the story. Then later on, the magic starts to happen and the things start to come together for her. So we have the same kind of idea in the story of Snow White. The same, we call it a motif or a story theme. You might call it a trope. That the right thing to do is to bide your time and keep doing your work and know that the rewards will come. I want to make clear that in a fairy tale, it's not about a particular person. This is why the woke Disney interpretation is wrong. This is not a story about Snow White. This is in the fairy tale, every part of the fairy tale is part of your psyche. So everything in the fairy tale represents the war or the battle within your own psyche. It's very important. And this is what has become completely lost in modern day storytelling, which tends to have a character A and character B and character C, and then they come along and interact. No, these are, in fairy tales, these are all part of your own mind. And it's the battle, it's teaching children to start to understand these warring parts of their own psyche, their conflicting desires. So to identify Snow White as a girl is completely wrong. Snow White is a part of your psyche, whether you're male or female, whether you're child or adult. She's part of your psyche and she's representing part of your psyche. Her evil stepmother is also representing part of your psyche, as we will see. The prince who comes along also representing part of your psyche. That's why these tales were not for girls or for boys. Like Jack and the Beanstalk, one of my favorite stories. That's not for boys. There's no reason why girls can't enjoy Jack and the Beanstalk and identify with the character and learn the lessons of the story just as much as any boy can. And the same for Snow White. It's not about a female, it's not a female story. It's not a story about a girl. It's a story about your mind. Whether you're male or female doesn't matter. They're just using these motifs, these symbols, in order to tell the story. Now, the idea with a fairy tale is it is a dream. So it is using the psychological symbols that you will experience in your dream world, but bringing them out onto a text. So they are effectively a shared dream. It's a dream and that's why they're so bizarre. And again, why modern storytellers get it wrong when they try and change the fairy tale. For example, in this story, the mother sends the daughter out to be murdered and has her heart brought back to her, and she eats the heart. What doesn't make much sense as a story, right? If you're telling a story about different people, and to go and murder your own child and eat their heart makes no story, it makes no sense in any kind of rational way. But in a dream, it makes sense. In the dream world, all of these things are symbols. They're not to be taken literally and to be real. They're symbols for something within you. So the story is one of biding your time, of doing the right thing, and is full of these beautiful, beautiful symbols. And I tell you, before I came to talk to you today, I checked up online for some of the analysis of these fairy tales. And I'm always like shocked that nobody brings up these points. There was a famous book called the man, I have it. If you're interested, it's this book here called it's coming out reversed in my picture, but the Uses of Enchantment by Bruno Bettelheim. And it's a really, really good book if you're interested in this kind of thing. He doesn't know Dharma. He gets a lot of things wrong, but nonetheless, he does. This is probably the only really good introduction to how to understand fairy tales and why fairy tales are structured the way that they are. Okay, can you see that? Is that coming out the right way? Because that's coming out reversed on mine. Oh, you see it the right way. Okay. So it looks reversed to me, but there you go. So he does a really good job of explaining why the fairy tales should be left the way that they are. By the way, Einstein said the same thing. He said, if you want your children to grow up smart, you should read them fairy tales. On the other hand, I don't think we should really look to someone as bizarre as Einstein for lessons on how to bring up children. He was a great mathematician, but I very much doubt he was a good parent. Yeah, so that's been put into the chat there. It is a good book, but note, he doesn't know Dharma, and he does get a number of things mistaken. So let's go over to the Snow White tale. I'm going to go onto the share screen. You should see the Once Upon a Time in Middle of Winter. Is that coming through full screen for you? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay. So the story goes like this. I'll just point out some of the things to note as we go through it. But I'm going to go through a little more quickly. I'm not going to read the whole thing. So once upon a time, there were snowflakes were falling from the sky. And a queen was sat there sewing by a window frame that was made from black ebony. While she was sewing, she looked out of the window and she pricked her finger with a needle, and some drops of blood fell upon the snow. Catch the image of blood on the snow, that striking visual image. The red looked pretty on the white snow, and she thought, oh, if I could have a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and black as the wood of the window frame. So again, this isn't about race, right? This is about color. Soon after that, she had a daughter who was white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was black as ebony. So she was called Snow White. Now, in this story, the queen dies, but in the original Grimm story, the queen doesn't die. She stays alive. So a year had passed, and the king had himself another wife, a beautiful woman. So this is the stepmother, comes in. As I say, in the original tale, it just stayed with the original queen. So the queen goes to her magic looking glass, her magic mirror, and says, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the mirror looks her up and down and says, well, I think you're pretty hot. I'm going to go with you. And she was happy because she's the hottest, fairest woman in all the land. But Snow White grows up and becomes more and more beautiful, until eventually she becomes even more beautiful than the queen herself. And when the queen goes to the magic mirror and says, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" the mirror answers, I think it's going to be your daughter Snow White. Now, the queen is shocked and turns yellow and green with envy. Again, note the colors here. This is to think of it with a child's mind, not with an adult's mind. You might say, well, that's a bit immature. She shouldn't be envious. But no, this is a fairy tale. So she's absolutely furious, and her heart heaved in her breast. She hated the girl so much. Envy and pride grew higher and higher in her heart like a weed. She had no peace day or night. So she called a huntsman and says, "Take my child away to the forest and kill her and bring back her heart as a token." So the huntsman obeyed and took away the Snow White, the young girl. And he drew his knife, but she was so sweet that he didn't want to kill her. And she says, "Oh, please leave me. I'll run away into the forest. I'll never come home again." So the huntsman took pity on her and let her run off into the forest. Although in this story, he thinks to himself, the animals will soon devour you. So he wasn't that good, was he? By the way, huntsmen are usually good in fairy tales. So she goes running off. The huntsman kills a boar and takes out the boar's heart and takes that to the queen. And the queen puts salt on it and thinks that she's eaten Snow White. Now, the child is all alone and she runs through the forest. Eventually, she finds herself in a cottage that is very neat and very clean. In the cottage were some plates and some small plates and some small cutlery and knives and forks and mugs and some food. So she ate some food off each of the plates. She drank a little bit out of each of the mugs. And then she lay herself down on each of the beds to find which bed was the most suitable for her. So after a while, while she's lying there, when it was dark, the owners of the cottage come back. They were 7 dwarves who dug in the mountains for ore. Please note, there is no happy, smiley, grumpy Doc. Disney made those 7 dwarves into 7 different characters because they wanted to do comedy in the movie. Note that in the original tale, specifically, the 7 dwarves have no character. Their only character is they dig in the mountain, which is important. So there is no happy, in case you haven't seen the Disney version. In Disney, the 7 dwarves are given names. So there is Sneezy, Happy, Grumpy, Doc. Is the only 4 I can remember. But each of the 7 dwarves was given a comedy characteristic. So in the story, they're just 7 dwarves, and there's no real difference between them. So eventually the 7 dwarves, they come across Snow White and they're like, oh wow, what a lovely child. And they were so glad. And they let her sleep on the bed until she woke up. Note, these 7 dwarves are nice. They're not at all threatening. When it was morning, Snow White awoke and she was scared by the 7 dwarves, but they're friendly. She said, "My name is Snow White." And she told them the story of how she came to her house. So the dwarves said to her, and here's the key part: "If you take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us and you will want for nothing. Yes, she said, with all my heart. I want you to note, this wasn't the role that's really given to her, because their house was already clean. There was already food cooked. Everything was already neat and tidy. That the seven dwarves are that character. So she says, fine, and she enjoys her time there. But the queen goes to the magic mirror and says, who's mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the mirror says, I'm afraid that Snow White is way hotter than you are. You're like way down the list. And so the queen is furious because she thought Snow White was dead. So she plots to kill Snow White, her daughter, or in the latest tale, her stepdaughter. So she puts on a disguise, and she finds her way to the little cottage in the forest and says, I have some things to sell. Here's the important line. I have some things, pretty things to sell, stay laces of all colors. So this is a lace bodice. You may remember women at the time, to be beautiful, would put on these corsets, which would bind the waist really tight. So that's what this thing is a white bodice. It's white because it's not supposed to interfere with the color of the dress. So she pulls out one of these, and Snow White, has very innocent, has no suspicion, and she let herself be laced up in this corset. But the old queen, she tied the corset so tight that Snow White lost consciousness and falls down onto the ground. The queen thinks, great, she's going to die, and runs off home. Now the seven dwarfs, they come back and they see her, and they untie her from this bodice, and she comes back to life. So the queen goes back and she asks the mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of the wall? And the mirror says, you know, Snow White is getting hotter day by day. You don't make the cut, I'm afraid, dear queen. And she gets even more furious. So she says, I will. She tries her second method to kill Snow White, and she makes a poisonous comb. A poisonous comb. She goes along to the forest. Now, even though the dwarves have told Snow White, do not answer the door to anybody, don't let anybody into the house, she still lets the queen into her house, and she pays the price. The queen puts the comb in her hair. The comb is poisonous, and Snow White falls down unconscious. The queen thinks, great, I've killed her, and goes back to her palace. Again, for the last time, she says, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the mirror says, Snow White is still fairer than you, because the dwarves found the comb and took it out of her hair. So the last thing that she tried, she made an apple that is white on one side and red on the other. I never saw a white apple, but it is important to note the colors. The red part of the apple is coated in poison, and the white part is not poisonous. That's really important to note. So she goes along to the house again and in disguise and convinces Snow White to take the apple, even though Snow White is told, don't let anyone in the house. To prove the apple is okay, the witch or the queen takes a bite from the white side of it. So Snow White thinks, hey, that apple must be fine. And she takes a bite from the red side, and immediately it poisons her and she falls down dead. The dwarves come home and they find her there dead on the ground. And they're heartbroken, so they decide to bury her, but she looks so beautiful, they can't bring themselves to bury her. So they make a white casket or coffin. By the way, coffins were an upmarket form of casket. A casket was a lower quality thing. And they make one out of glass, and they put her in this glass coffin, and they keep her on the top of the hill. And she stays there in suspended animation, so it seems. Eventually, a king's son comes and he sees the coffin and he convinces the dwarves, let me take the coffin. I will honor and worship this woman, this girl in the coffin, even though she's dead. So he rides off with the coffin. Now, in this, the version that I have here, the king's men who are carrying the coffin stumble. And when they stumble, the apple comes out of her mouth and she wakes up. In another version of the tale, she's lying in the coffin, but one of the servants comes along and pats her on the back. And when he pats her on the back, the apple comes out of her mouth and she wakes up. So once she's woken up, the prince says, hey, you're so beautiful. I want to be your husband. And she says, that's fine. You look pretty hot to me too. And you're a prince, so you've got loads of money. I'm in. And they get married. And they send out the invites for the wedding. And the queen, the wicked queen, gets an invite. So she goes along to the wedding because she can't believe that Snow White is back again. And when she's there, the king, the new royal family, have made some iron shoes and heated them up in a fire till they're red hot. And they force the wicked queen into the red shoes. And so she dances around in pain until she dies. So this is a German fairy tale that was read to German children, and now you know why Germans are so messed up. Okay, so the motifs in the story, please remember that all of the characters are a part of your psyche. It's not a story about a girl and a mother. First thing to note, the mother is very vain and is looking in the mirror and needs that compliment. So you can imagine the young child. Part of their psyche wants to be the prettiest girl in the room, or wants to be the smartest boy in the room, or wants to be the toughest in the room. They want admiration from their parents. So the queen here is representing that part of you that is vain and is looking for confirmation and admiration from outside. So she wants a child white as snow, red as blood, and black as wood. So this is nothing to do with race, the way that Disney is worried that it might be. There are three colors here: white, red, and black. So when Snow White is born, by the way, this tale on screen, they replace the queen with a stepmother. The reason for this is for every child, when they are young, the mother takes care, and the mother appears as an angel that looks after them and feeds them and every need that they have. But as a child gets older, suddenly the mother changes, and instead of feeding you whenever you're hungry or changing you whenever you soil yourself, she starts to introduce rules and starts to like bark at the children. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do this. So to a child, the beautiful mother has now been changed into two mothers: the beautiful fairy godmother who gives you what you want, and the evil stepmother who can't possibly be your mother because she's barking at you and snapping at you and setting rules for you that you don't want to follow. So to a child, and that's a witch, right? This is why witches in the stories fly around on brooms. If your mum is busy in the house and you're a child and you get in her way, you're probably going to get a whack with the broom. She's going to clear you out of the way. So witches were literally like the child trying to work out, how come previously my mother was always this beautiful angel that gave me what I wanted, but now I seem to have two different mothers, and one I have to be careful and afraid of, and the other still loves me. So the motifs in the story fit the psychological experience of the child. So in the original story, it just stayed with the queen. In the later story, the Grimms change it to be a stepmother. Okay, so Snow White goes off into the forest. The forest represents your own mind. When you start to become awakened to your own psyche, this is an evil forest. You don't know what's in there. You have thoughts and fears and neuroses, and that's forests are dangerous places. I know these days we think of a forest supposed to be really nice, and we're supposed to be ecological and green, and forests are good. In those days, forests were full of evil spirits and animals that kill you. Forests are not good places to be. But in the forest, which is your own mind, you'll find a cottage. A cottage always represents your real self. A cottage and also a key. If they find a key, that will represent yourself. So inside the real self, you have these dwarves. And the reason the dwarves had no character, these are the parts of your psyche that just do their job, that just do what you're supposed to do, the daily grind, one day after another day after another day. They never show themselves. They're not flashy. They never get compliments. These are the dwarves, subterranean dwarves. Dwarves always go underground. And that's why they have no other character. This is why the dwarves are very neat and clean and hardworking. The modern day interpretation have said Snow White, why should she clean the house and cook for the dwarves? Because that's what dwarves do. She's learning the lesson from her inner psyche of looking after herself as a person and doing her job, doing the things that she's supposed to do. Whether you're male or female doesn't matter. There's a point where you are supposed to do your job. You do your daily grind. The rewards are going to come later in due course. So Snow White here is taking on the characteristics of the dwarves. This is the inner psyche learning to do its job. Now, the ego psyche is the queen that wants attention, that wants people to love her, that's willing to attack and defeat anyone around her who challenges her supremacy. I don't know, it's probably a long time since you were at school, but school can have a lot of this, especially on the girls' side. I don't want to offend anyone, but they can be really mean to each other in forming groups and throwing people out of the groups and trying to be the leader of the group. Boys can too, I have to say. So her learning to look after the house is learning to do what the dwarves do, which is doing your job, doing the duty. The story wants to convince the child to just do what they're supposed to do and not worry about what their older sister or their older brother or what their mothers are doing. Those things will come in due course. Now, the queen decides to kill her. Firstly, she's going to kill her with the bodice, with the corset. Now note, the corset is white, right? The second way the queen tries to kill Snow White is with the comb. And the comb is in the hair, which is black. You're getting this same color code of white, black, and red. The third time that Snow White is tried to be killed is by taking red through the lips. This is the sexualization, or if you're looking at young girls, it's wanting to use makeup and be beautiful before their time, before they're ready to, because they're looking at their older sisters. Or indeed for boys, when you start to have a sexual awakening and you start to see these things in other people, in girls or whatever, then you should bide your time as you're awakening, in transitioning from a child into an adult, or from a child into a sexual identity. You need to bide your time. So the three ways that she's attacked is by the white with the corset, by the black hair with the comb in the hair, and by the red of the apple that goes in the lips. So finally, she's put to sleep in a casket. Now, glass was still quite rare in 1812 when Grimm was writing this fairy tale. So there would have been no glass coffins. That would be utterly bizarre. So we can view the coffin. Anything that's crystal represents something that's good. But crystals live down in the belly, in the psyche. You remember dragons? Dragons always live in a lair, and in their lair they have valuable things, rubies, diamonds, gold. The dragons take the valuable things down into the belly, into the stomach, into the squishy, watery part of the psyche, the unconscious. You notice dragons usually have a pearl in their mouth. Yeah. So the glass casket, glass means it's something valuable and it's something that's buried deep down. Once it's brought out of the unconscious, the glass is no longer needed. There's another metaphor that I saw here that somebody suggested was, it's like a cocoon. So it's like the moth is, or the caterpillar is now lived its life as a caterpillar. It's in the cocoon, and then it's going to break out as a beautiful butterfly. So the glass coffin is like that cocoon. It's quite a beautiful interpretation. So we're almost at the end here. The prince comes along. Now the prince, again, the complaint from the modern woke interpretation is women say, I shouldn't need a man to validate my existence. And that wasn't the point. The prince coming along is the fulfillment of destiny. It's just as often a boy in the story, and it's a princess that he meets, and she fulfills his destiny. It's the blossoming of the character into the new awakened self that is complete. So it doesn't matter whether it's male or the princess or the girl finding the boy or the boy finding the girl. The point is that prince arriving is the fulfillment of the destiny. Now is her moment, and that's symbolized by the prince. So, by the way, while she was asleep, I'm not sure if it's in this version or not, while she was asleep in the casket, she is visited by an owl, a raven, and a dove. They visit her while she's asleep. Now, the owl is usually tawny red color, right? Or brown color. The raven is black color and the dove is white color. So she's visited by the white, the black, and the red. Again, these three powerful colors are symbols of the story. So finally, as we wrap up here, the queen finds out that Snow White is now a princess. She comes and she has to put on the hot red shoes and dance until she dies. Now, shoes always represent sexuality. So the queen has an over-sexualized character or persona. Again, this is telling the children or the child, you want to become an adult and you're awakening from a child and you're growing into a sexual being, into an adult. Don't move too fast. That sexual side of you is something that needs to be controlled. The Snow White side of you that does your job, that's the side that you're supposed to follow. And that's what a child is supposed to get out of the story. They're supposed to be learning to start to control these thoughts and urges from the adult character that's starting to awaken in their being. So that's why the queen puts on these bright red hot shoes. Shoes always represent sexuality, whether it's a beautiful shoe or a painful shoe or a high boot. The shoes always represent that. Shoes, by the way, can also represent action. When you're ready to take action, you put your shoes on. So the queen, who is the over-sexualized, the over-vain, the overreaching, controlling part of the psyche, that part of your psyche has to die. And that's why the story is right, that she dies a horrible death. You should remove from your psyche these unpleasant parts of yourself and live with the good parts of yourself. So in terms of Dharma, we have this theme of that is not just about children waking up into adulthood, but about whenever we're striving to reach something, is knowing how to bide our time. Our job is this breath, this thought, that thought. If you're opening a business, it's this post, this sale, this person, and not overreaching, waiting for the destiny to ripen at its right time is a lesson for all of humanity. And indeed, we find this theme through many, many fairy tales and stories, not just ones for children. So I'm just checking the time there. I'm going to stop there. And I hope that that's brought to life the story of Snow White, that if you see it or hear it, Disney has apparently now had some backlash against their rewriting of the tale. And they are apparently going to cut the budget and make this movie as a straight to streaming release or something like that. I'm not sure, but it's been in the news a lot recently about Snow White and how it's been rewritten in a bad way. If people know what these symbols mean, then they would stick to the original story. You can't change Snow White into a non-white character. It doesn't make any sense. It upsets all the imagery throughout the tale. There aren't many tales for children who aren't white. By the way, white in the Brothers Grimm day, the whiter your skin, the higher class that you were, right? You understand that. It's the same in Thailand now. The supermarkets and shops are filled with skin whitening stuff because people, women, mostly girls, want to appear white. The darker your skin, the lower class you seem to appear. Now, one would hope that in the modern day we can get past judging people like that, but that's the way society is, and that's the way society was when Grimm was writing his tales. It's funny because in England, when I grew up in the 1980s, airfare had just started to come down to the level where ordinary people could fly abroad on holiday. So it became more classy to have brown skin. And so even now in the West, they have, what are they, fake tan? These tanning things, the ointments you put on your skin to make you look darker, because that now would be higher class than having white skin. So I'm not sure that we've got beyond the idea of the symbology, but note that in Brothers Grimm day, people who worked outside in the fields would be more tanned, and people who are a princess that would have whiter skin that's never seen sunlight and never had any vitamin D and will probably fall sick by the time that they're 40. Okay, so if there are anybody have any questions or comments or disagreements or something you want me to talk more on?
Just one question. The role of the hunter who let Snow White go and escape.
What about him? You mean just generally his role?
Yes, sir.
So a hunter is something, as I said, the forest is always something that's nasty in a fairy tale. The forest is not somewhere that you want to be. I know Disney made their cartoon full of beautiful little butterflies and deers, and they all come around Snow White, and it's all very nice. But in fairy tales, the forest is where you don't want to be. When you cut down the forest and civilize the area, that's where you want to be. So the huntsman is the one that goes into the forest and is not afraid of the ghosts, and he can kill the wild animals. So the huntsman nearly always in fairy tales is going to be a good character that is going to save the person in some way. In this case, he saves Snow White, although it did say in the Grimm's fairy tale that he assumed that the wild animals would kill her.
Mm.
Nonetheless, the huntsman is always good. Now, the woodsman is like a higher huntsman, because the woodsman doesn't just go into the forest and kill the nasty animals. The woodsman will chop down the trees and get rid of the forest and make a town where people can live in safety. So a woodsman is always going to be good. If you remember Little Red Riding Hood, which is a same tale, essentially, as she is saved by a woodsman. In one of the stories, Little Red Riding Hood is swallowed by the bad wolf and is living in the wolf's stomach, and the woodsman comes and cuts the wolf's stomach, and Little Red Riding Hood pops out, which is a warning about falling pregnant, right, and having babies. Then Little Red Riding Hood flees away from the bad wolf, and she comes to a river where the women are washing sheets, and they have the white sheets stretched out across the river. And Little Red Riding Hood goes across the lines where the white sheets are into the safety of the women. They're very important, these motifs. They're trying to encourage girls not to get caught in sexuality, but to take refuge in the women who know what they're doing and what they're talking about. So as the wolf tries to cross the lines, the washing lines across the river, the women cut the lines and the wolf falls into the water and gets washed away. So again, you have this story that trying to teach the children, male or female, don't get caught up in this awakening sexuality or these ambitions or vanity. Take your refuge in the older people who know what, the parents who know what they're doing, and they're going to teach you restraint. So the huntsman and the woodsman are almost universally good characters in fairy tales, but they're never the central character. You never have a story about the woodsman. You have a story about they just come and aid.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bhante, thank you for such a rich presentation. You may have said it and I might not have registered. It seems like perhaps your main Buddhist point about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is you're referring to the meditative process, that we need to take our time, we need to abide by it, that we need to do the nitty-gritty or the daily bit, yeah? And that comes out in the story of Snow White.
Yes.
Similar way. But are there other Buddhist messages, or are there other Buddhist teachings or concepts in the same story, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs?
So to me, the two main central parts of this story, firstly, is you need to control the red part of your psyche. That is the greedy part, the highly sexualized part, the angry part, the vain part. All of these qualities of the queen are your kilesa, are the bad parts of your character. And these need to be controlled. It's quite important. Very often in Vipassana, they say, well, just observe and just watch. Now, in original Buddhism, the Buddha was very, very, very clear. He says, you need to control desires. Yes, when you're enlightened, you'll have no more desires, but your practice is one of controlling desire, controlling behavior, doing the right thing. So the queen represents all those bad things. She's vain, she's highly sexualized, she's angry, she's envious, she's murderous. She wants to remove the people that threaten her or seem to threaten her. That part of our psyche, we have to learn to control.
Yeah.
The beautiful part of our psyche the one that's willing to just do your job, just do your work, keep everything neat and clean and ordered and go about your business. That's the part of your psyche that we should be developing. So that's why Snow White is the heroine of the story here, that we're trying to teach people to follow the good part of your psyche. The second part, which is again a common motif, is this idea of doing your job and keeping your house clean. The house always represents yourself. So keeping your house clean means you're looking after your thoughts, your desires, your ambitions, your speech, actions of body, speech, and mind. You need to be looking after these in the right way, and trust that in the fullness of time, then the greater rewards are going to come your way. So these are the two main themes. Snow White is aimed more at children and the sexual awakening, or the transition from childhood into adulthood. But there are just as many adult stories with these exact same themes written into them. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I felt that, but I'm glad you say it explicitly, that the central Buddhist teaching of the cause of all suffering, desire, and the story shows all these unwholesome desires of the queen that gets into all that suffering, isn't it?
Yeah. And queen is part of your psyche. As I said at the beginning, fairy tales need to be understood not as this character against that character, but every character, every color, every bird, every animal in the story is part of your psyche.
Yes.
So the fairy tale is a way to teach, yes, children, but adults too, of how to order and structure your own psyche.
Yeah.
But not by telling you, and not by preaching at you, and not by, because the child won't understand these things if you explain it out loud. So we use stories because these symbols will come in very powerfully to a child, but they work too for adults. Filmmakers use symbols all the time, symbology all the time. I saw a movie recently. It was about a woman, a young woman in her 20s probably, and she was starting to discover she's a lesbian. That was the theme of the movie. And there was a point where she has to clean the outside of a caravan with a hose pipe. And the second part, further down the story, she had to get in a swimming pool. And the third part is she had to get in the sea. So the filmmakers are using this powerful symbology of going into the water. And where the water is this squelchy kind of subconscious place where all these nasty things, but all these emotions live. So film writers and developers are using these kinds of motifs all the time.
Yeah.
They're very powerful, and you might not notice it. And this raises one question that nobody's mentioned yet, but should fairy tales be explained? Well, definitely not to children. The explanation will be less informative than the fairy tale itself. The fairy tale itself should be the thing that starts to structure within the child. They start to recognize in themselves when they're being like the nasty queen, when they're being like Snow White, when they're being like the seven dwarfs. The seven dwarfs are always happy doing their job. They go about their job and they're cheerful doing it. Well, there's a time when you have to do that. So you shouldn't explain fairy tales to children. However, because adults don't understand the motifs and the dharma of these tales, they start rewriting them into like dumb stuff. I don't know, Madonna didn't like fairy tales, so she wrote a whole bunch of stories into the Madonna's children's storybook. I said, well, these are nicer stories because I'm going to teach my children not to eat somebody's heart. Yeah. So we can see what Madonna's children have grown up like to see if that worked or not. Sue, you were
Bhante
taking some
always
notes there. Were you, you're still on mute. You're on mute, Susan. Yeah.
A long time ago, I was very into fairy tales. I was for a few years I was a children's librarian, and
Okay.
and I did my master's specialization in fairy tales. And
Wow. Okay.
yes, so I love them, and it's just as you say that they represent all the different aspects of our being.
Right.
And Bhante Teja too always talks about the forest representing, the scary parts of ourselves. And and when the Buddha encourages people to go into the forest to practice, it doesn't necessarily literally mean the forest. It can mean the forest of your own heart and mind,
Right.
where all kinds of wild things might dwell.
Yeah. Sexuality in Buddhism was always represented by crocodiles, because they live in that watery, squelchy thing, and it's the crocodiles that'll come out and grab you. And once they've grabbed you, you're ruined. But there was in psychology, there are certain tricks that Freudians use, or Jungian psychologists. And one of them is to ask your patient, imagine yourself in a forest, describe the forest. And if they describe like nice mossy plains with an occasional large oak tree with some birds in it, you say, well, their psyche is pretty good. But if they describe a forest as like tight, dense jungle full of mosquitoes and snakes, then that's the way that they're interpreting their mind. So in this form of psychology, you take people through a series of questions. Imagine a forest, imagine a bear, imagine a stream or some water, imagine a wall, and how you describe, because you're left open to describe these things however you want, and how you describe them is showing the person about your psyche without asking them directly. So, for example, if they're walking through the forest, you have the person in their mind walk through the forest. They can imagine the forest however they want. And then they meet a bear, and you say, right, describe the bear. And some people describe a mean, nasty bear that's going to kill them. Some people describe something that's far off and isn't going to bother them. Some people describe a cuddly teddy bear that they're going to pick up and keep with them. So the bear is how you represent other people in your mind. So when you meet somebody or meet strangers, are you afraid of them? Do you want to cuddle them? Do you ignore them? So by using these symbols, you can draw out from your patient some really deep insights into their character. But the fascinating thing about that is that these symbols really do work. They're not even just based on culture, although there are some cultural variations. These symbols really do work in our psyche, and that's why we dream with them. Yeah. When you did your thesis on fairy tales, did you do much like analysis in this way, or were you more analyzing the general themes?
No, as far as I can remember, because it's a very long time ago, I did do analysis in this way, and I particularly the Grimm fairy tales, and this is one of them, are the most powerful, and they are so graphic. And you really wonder why all those German children weren't terrified to death when they heard them. But I mean, I think that was the point. They were to be terrified into good behavior, and understand that there was real danger out there, and they shouldn't be seduced away by strange women who came to the door, and that kind of thing.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
The Grimms had a they claim that they didn't write any of their stories, but that actually isn't true. They claim they just collected the stories from their nanny, that she told them the stories. But there's recent analysis into that, and it's probably not true. They were, in fact, both of them were really good at crafting tales. So they reimagined these stories and rewrote these stories, and they really knew what they're talking about. And if you read any of their notes, they are, very clear. They knew what they were doing when they put these things together. Because that's a question that people ask me: do these storytellers know what they're doing with these symbols? And I think the answer is yes. I think certainly, 50 years ago or 100, 200 years ago, the Grimm's time, I think people were more adept at these things than we are now. We got lazy. We just let David Cameron, not David Cameron, he was a prime minister. We let the Steven Spielberg do all the hard work for us.
Yes, well, I would say that that's why they've endured. They have been passed down from generation to generation. And the Grimm brothers were just really collecting something which has been around for a hell of a long time.
Right. And I'm hoping you're right that they will survive the modern day kind of rewrites. Since we have them, they should survive. And but it's a question of whether parents actually read these things to their children anymore. I'm not sure parents read stuff to children anymore.
Reverend, are there similar Buddhist tales, whether they're especially for children or for adults, Buddhist tales, which of course would then also use animals and the forest as symbols?
Yes, but the different areas had different forms of storytelling. So this kind of Freudian or Jungian dreamscape storytelling was fairly unique to Russia and Europe. So other cultures had different kind of forms. So the form in Buddhism, you had two forms. One was the childlike story. So, there was the elephant, the crow, and the monkey, and they're all sitting there, and they're trying to decide which one of them should be the leader. This is a famous story. It comes from the Jataka tales. But in Buddhism, tend to be kind of one-dimensional. Then there is the stories that the Buddha would use, but he always explained the stories. So in one case, he talks about a person going into a town that's empty of people. And in the town, he sees pots. And in the pots, he opens them up and he looks inside each of the pots and he finds different things in the pots. And then as he goes in further, the pots are empty. Well, these pots are the things, like I said, about the casket down in the unconscious. And the Buddha said as much. He said, these pots represent the things, the pleasures of the senses. When you open them up and look inside, you're going to find that they're empty. So the Buddha always explained his use of symbology very precisely. And so there's little room for doubt or question. But the Buddha used these kind of symbols a lot, but he always explained it. Yeah. The particular dreamscape kind of stories are really German and Russian. The French and Italians had the same stories, but they weren't quite as adept at the like capturing the dream like quality of it. The British had some too, but again, British also weren't quite so adept.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm aware of the time. But this talk, especially about fairy tale is always very deep. And today I feel like I'm in the forum of all these expert psychologists, fairy tale expert. Bhante, would you mind giving us the blessing before we end the day? Thank you so much for being here with us. And this time difference next October, your next talk will be daylight saving starting. So I'll remind you of the timing. All right.
Sabhitiyo vivachantu sabbarogo ina satumate bhavatvantarayo sukhiti yuko bhava abhivadana sili sanichang Vuta pachayino chataro Dhamma vadanti ayuvano sukhang balang. Okay, thanks.
Sadhu.
Nice to see you
Thank
all
you,
and
Bhante.
see you next month.
Thank you. Thank you
Bhante.
so much, Bhante. Good night, everyone.
Good
Yeah.
Thank you
night.
for being here.
Good to see you all.
Yes.
See you.
Bye,
See you
Mum.
next week.